We just did a roundtable earlier today with, it was Anisha, Catalyst, and Fluent, where we talked about the positioning and future of alt VMs in the context of chain abstraction. It was a really interesting conversation because, you know, I went into this roundtable. I wasn't skeptical on alt VMs as a concept, but I kind of always saw the alt VM landscape as sort of confrontational to EVM, if that makes sense. Like, I kind of viewed it as, okay, there's all these different VMs that are basically competing to replace, you know, the Ethereum virtual machine. And I just haven't really bought into that concept that much. I think the Ethereum virtual machine just has so much, like so many network effects, and it's gained so much mind share that it would be really difficult to dethrone it completely. But what we discussed with, I think it was Zon from Anisha, Jim from Catalyst, and Dino from Fluent. What we discussed was that the virtual machine landscape can kind of not be thought of as like, I guess it depends who you ask. So if you ask Movement, they probably would say like it's confrontational to EVM. It's supposed to like usurp EVM. But during our conversation, at least these guys, which they're a little bit more neutral within kind of the alt VM space, but what they told me, and I like this positioning, was that specifically, especially like as we get further down the chain abstraction roadmap, what's going to happen is that virtual machines become sort of like DA layers kind of for applications and app chains, where they choose whatever VM is really best for their like use case. So like I think it was Jim that used the term like purpose-built applications. They use virtual machines that have certain properties that match their needs at that given point in time. And so less of like we're trying to replace EVM and like we're trying to get everybody off of EVM and onto these like alternative VMs, which are going to compete for like EVM equivalent mindshare. But more so of like, hey, we're introducing all of these additional like options for developers. And the problem with that positioning right now is that like as a developer, it doesn't make a lot of sense to launch an app chain or launch an application on non-EVM chains, unless it's like Solana, because the problem is that users are pretty much siloed between EVM and Solana today. That's where like the majority of Web3 user base is. And so if I deploy on some alternative VM that is more niche or doesn't really have users, then the overhead of me getting users and liquidity in my application is like 10x that if I just deploy on EVM. And so the benefits of deploying on an alt VM today versus just deploying on EVM for most applications, I think is not like the value isn't really there from a business perspective. And so what we were talking about during the roundtable is like chain abstraction is going to actually enable and make the value proposition of launching on alt VMs viable for these projects and these developers. Because like if you can launch your application on any virtual machine that you want to without the consequences of losing immediate access to users and liquidity, because of course in like the chain abstraction environment, then like if I launch on MoveVM, it doesn't really matter because users that have funds on Ethereum or EVM or on Solana or whatever, they can use my application in the same capacity that they could if I just launch on EVM. And so if that barrier is no longer there, I think what we're going to see is a big surge in applications and projects moving towards alt VMs, because from a technological standpoint, it makes sense. It's just from a business standpoint, it doesn't really make sense today. Because there isn't enough, there's just not enough users on these that already have funds within these different ecosystems to make it viable. But that whole issue basically gets removed, and the same property basically applies, in my opinion, to app chains. Right? It's like launching an app chain today. Of course, like we've seen this blow up because the value accrual is there. But still, it actually suffers kind of from the same problem that like if I launch an app chain, even if it's on EVM, I still need to get users to manually bridge into my app chain, right? Or deposit new funds into it from an on-ramp or something like that. So this is just like, I mean, there's a big hurdle and like like you have to motivate users to do this. And so with chain abstraction, I think this like a similar property is going to be applied to app chains, where you can basically launch your application on an app chain without the consequence of losing access to users, right? And so because if I'm a user and I have all my funds on Base, because that's where I on-ramp to, or that's where I use most of my apps on or whatever, and then I want to go use some application that's on an app chain, unbeknownst to me, ideally, then I just use it, right? And like there's no like intentional bridging into that chain. I mean, it's just I'm using the application, it's done for me. But anyways, I've been thinking a lot about this the other day after that roundtable.
Yo, I'm curious. One thing I've been trying to wrap my head around here is honestly, I hate when people make internet analogies when we talk about crypto and talk about like, oh, well, in like 2001, it looked like this. Because honestly, most of us were like fetuses at that point in time. One thing I'm trying to understand though is what the value accrual looks like at the virtual machine layer. And so kind of obviously the like Web 2 parallel here is like the Microsoft OS wars and like Linux and stuff. And I'm not going to pretend like I was like conscious at this point in time where I could like really have critical thoughts here. But one thing I'm curious for your take on is like right now it feels like we're in this super narrative driven like alt VM wave. But kind of looking forward a few years into the future, who really makes money off of alt VM? Like which projects actually really truly benefit from adoption of alt VMs? Curious for your take there.
Like the whole alt VM narrative is relatively new to me. From my perspective, I always figured that like the flagship chain or like the representation of that alt VM, like Movement or Solana or whatever, and their token is what accrues the most value. I guess if everybody's launching on MoveVM, then like the corresponding token that's attached to like Movement itself would accrue
Sure, but I
value.
guess like
Yeah,
stepping, hopefully growing out of just like a
right.
narrative side, like who's making the money? Like at a literal level, like who is actually capturing value and making revenue? And I understand that we're miles away from any of these projects really making money right now, but and like I do think we're going to be stepping towards this like more fundamentals driven reality in the coming years here. So I'm kind of thinking on like a 3 to 5 year time frame.
Yeah, that's interesting. Arjun, what do you think about that?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I've kind of like said a couple of times, and this is a controversial take, and a lot of people really hate this, but like I think like general purpose VMs are kind of doomed because if you think about it, like look at just what's happening right now. When you look at existing general purpose VMs, even the successful ones like Arbitrum or general purpose chains, regardless of VM, even the successful ones like Arbitrum are losing their biggest projects because those biggest projects are spitting out to create their own chains. This is something that's like going to continue happening just because people want sovereignty, right? That's like the whole idea behind the app chain thesis. When you kind of take that to the extreme, like who is building these app chains? It's going to be like big players, both like inside and outside of crypto. And like what companies want, regardless of whether you're in Web 2 or Web 3, as you achieve scale, is just like extreme verticalization and very, very granular control over your environment. And so like my hypothesis is that like a lot of the like ideas and thinking around LVMs, like when you really think about it, right, you could turn anything into a rollup. All you have to do is just generate like proofs of successful execution of a state machine and then like put those proofs on chain. And you can do that in JavaScript, you can do that in Rust, you could do that in whatever really you want. And it's like not a difficult process to convert existing code bases into a format where they can generate proofs. What we're doing today, which is like making companies come to crypto and learn how to use Solidity, learn how to use all this like custom tooling. Instead, like enterprise sales teams going and selling to existing companies to help them convert their existing code bases into being something where like parts of those code bases can be decentralized public goods. And in that kind of world, like where does alt VMs fall? Well, like I think in that kind of a world, like the EVM becomes a lot less important just because it'll be useful for like all of the general purpose stuff that perhaps needs to happen that, maybe like as a generic interface for people to build. But it's probably pretty likely that people are running some sort of like hybrid setup where a lot of their own code is kind of the alt, like in whatever alt VM, in whatever like custom format they need to work with their existing code base. And then there's just like an EVM interface that people can build on. I guess to get back to your question, Austin, who makes the money here? It's an interesting question. This is maybe like why I'm a little bearish. Like I don't think that the general purpose all VM chains are going to like survive. Or if they do, they'll become like launch pads. I do think that the companies behind those chains can actually make a lot of money by basically going and like selling to existing like larger scale organizations on an enterprise basis. And this does look a little bit more like the Red Hat model.
What's up, Rich?
Hey, I'm pretty sure there was a talk about 2 years ago in Paris during the Modular Summit, where one of the Rollup-as-a-Service providers gave a talk talking about how they were convinced that rollup frameworks are going to zero in the long term. And back then it was pretty controversial because like all the rollup frameworks were popping up. And I think now, in light of all these projects building their own chains, it's pretty clear there's something fundamentally flawed with the sort of like rollup framework model that got pushed over the last 2 years, 3 years-ish. The question of who makes money, I'd actually go the opposite direction of Arjun. I think the people who end up making the most money from these rollup frameworks will actually end up being Rollup-as-a-Service providers, which begs the question, given that Rollup-as-a-Service providers don't necessarily build the infrastructure frameworks themselves, but are the ones capitalizing the most on the value that's being aggregated there, any forward-thinking rollup framework is probably most incentivized to either start building your own Rollup-as-a-Service providers or start acquiring Rollup-as-a-Service providers, because that's the only way you end up sort of like making money in the long term in a world where everyone starts spinning up their own chains. Because obviously, even though like these frameworks are open source, most people simply won't want to take on the burden of running them. And so there's always going to be this sort of like market for someone who runs this infrastructure for you. The question is, are the frameworks going to become those guys, or are they going to leave it to third parties who ultimately end up being bigger than them off their own work?
It's super funny because the talk that you are referencing was given by Neil from Eclipse.
Yes.
And while that guy has gotten absolutely fucking blacklisted from the industry, I do think he had a point here where it's like, you do have to have an underlying business model that is involved in the execution of these VMs. Personally, like I think the biggest bull argument for Movement is the like shared sequencer thing here, that they're like Optimism clearly and like Espresso are kind of trying to backwards fit this into the or not backwards, but like retroactively fit this into the ETH ecosystem. With Movement, like they're working with a bunch of these different rollups, and it's kind of in their interest day one to play friendly. But if if you're Optimism and you're trying to like work with Arbitrum, it's kind of against their business interest to do it when they already have a bill and TVL, etc. So yeah, that's personally my kind of like thesis on it, but was curious for your guys' takes.
Looking into Rollup-as-a-Service providers, and I'm familiar with like from the technical standpoint, how they function and the value that they have there. What is like, for example, for Caldera, what is the business model there? Is it just software as a service, like or in terms of like how they charge it, like from a revenue perspective, or do I misunderstand?
Currently, yes. They're just charging basically the cost of running those services in AWS.
There's a lot of like in this space focus around trying to build these like open protocols with a token and stuff like that. And like, it's obviously important, but the reality is like the vast majority of cases, we don't really know how to accrue value to the token, really in the vast majority of cases, right? But like a brick and mortar rollup as a service business just makes a lot of sense, right? Like it's just fairly understandable enterprise SaaS, and like, that is a very proven model that makes a ton of money. And like ultimately that actually positions whoever kind of owns that user, right? Like it's the same as like Web2, right? Whoever owns that user owns distribution and is now in like one of the most like powerful positions in the market. I've actually heard from rollup frameworks, really popular, very major rollup frameworks, that they're like meaningfully existentially concerned about like competing with RAS providers and are like pivoting either to like basically to become their own RAS providers as well for exactly that reason.
It's funny because it's almost, there's convergence on the other side as well with Conduit launching their like meta layer, I think it's called, where it's almost like an expansion in territory where not only are they able to charge the AWS costs, they kind of have like these network effects where they can I don't know off the top of my head what the meta layer actually does. I feel like it's some like faster finality confirmation thing, maybe some interop, but yeah, it's interesting to see both sides kind of leaning in and seeing if like the optimal position to be in from a business is with a bit of both of those, like actually like providing the infrastructural service as well as having some protocol that they are operating, which improves the product of actually running a rollup on their framework.
So the most sustainable revenue model here is going to be like traditional SaaS. That's kind of interesting. For example, MoveVM and like the Movement team, did they actually make revenue off of like the virtual machine itself? Or I guess not, right?
Nah, dude, I don't think anybody makes money directly off the VM itself other than like Microsoft. Like,
yeah, the way that like Arbitrum and Optimism do this is that there's like licensing stuff that you kind of get when you like work with the rest. So for instance, we're running an Orbit rollup, and the way that it works for us is like if you generate revenue with the sequencer and want to have like certain kinds of like opt into certain kinds of feature sets as part of the Orbit ecosystem, then you have to like sacrifice a certain percentage of your sequencer revenue. However, if you're not generating sequencer revenue, so if you're operating at like no profit technically at the rollup layer, or if you're not opting into certain kinds of features and are kind of running things yourself, like you're not paying anything. And so in that model, obviously Arbitrum has to kind of like enforce this through like meat space licensing means, but in that model, like their biggest winners are like Orbit rollups that are adhering to like Orbit standards that are doing lots and lots of transactions.
Yo, Arjun, the Everclear rollup is in Orbit L3, correct?
No, it's an L2, but with off-chain DA. Yeah.
Okay, built with off-chain DA. I'm curious. I've been chatting with a bunch of people who have chosen either the OP stack or the Orbit stack, and I hear pretty interesting takes where, like today, I was in a meeting. I won't like dox the team, but they said that they started working with the like super chain stack, but they actually believed that the Orbit stack was, from a technical perspective, way better. And it was more kind of the relationship that they had with the team of why they chose to use the OP stack. I'm curious how this went as you all were kind of evaluating the options.
Yeah, it's a great question. I've had a lot of people from different RAS providers and the Orbit team and also the OP stack team like ask about this because it seems like everybody's trying to get this feedback and figure out how to win. In general, it feels like this gap is like narrowed quite a bit. So like when we made this decision, it was almost 10 months ago, and things have changed meaningfully since then. But when we made this decision, there were 3 points. One was, at the time and I think that this has changed, but at the time we kind of heard that the Orbit stack was somewhat easier to run with the RAS providers that we talked to. And so there was just like better kind of uptime guarantees they could give us. I think that has definitely changed since then. The second was, at the time, Optimism didn't have the same kind of like forced exit stuff that Arbitrum did. Though I think this changed like pretty shortly after, like within the next like few months afterwards. And then the biggest reason was actually the 250 millisecond block time. Orbit stack rollups have just a super low block time that we needed as part of the way that our system works.
So I don't know if you all saw the like Unichain and like Flashbots collaboration, but like one component of that is, sure, there's like TEE stuff, etc. going on, but they have this Flash blocks thing in there. So what is Flashbox? It's a way to get effectively the same output of like faster blocks. It's not like the official block. They're calling it some like pre-confirmation thing. And it's 250 millisecond effectively block times on an OP stack. Why do they have to do that? Apparently it's because the data type that is used in the OP stack to reference block times cannot go below the unit 1. And it's like, okay, what do you mean it can't go below the unit 1? Apparently this is baked so deep into the stack that it's like in the smart contract level and deep like into the like fraud proof mechanism that some people have built prototypes for it. But the team that I was talking to this morning, they were like, honestly, the prototypes we've seen, like it's probably a year or two until this like is able to actually be like merged into prod. And this blew my fucking mind that like just by choosing like a specific type of data type, there is like a fundamental hindrance in that stack right now, to the point that they had to kind of create this like alternate Flash blocks type thing. It kind of blew my mind this morning hearing that.
That's super interesting. There's a lot of, honestly, there are so many different things in this space where like, because of some poorly considered configuration, when creating a system that everybody uses, now the entire industry, like an entire new branch of the industry has been built on top of it, right? So like, obviously the most salient example that we are all familiar with is like bridging. Like bridging only exists because the ERC20 spec did not effectively consider sharding as a core part of how it should function. Like even at the time, everybody was talking about ETH2 is going to have sharding, but nobody really thought very carefully about, should this mean that ERC20 tokens should intrinsically have a burn-in interface? And if they did have a burn-in interface, we wouldn't have bridges. This whole industry just wouldn't exist. At least liquidity bridges wouldn't exist. And then similarly, like there's a bunch of other similar things where there's like the signing curves that Ethereum has used, some of the core like cryptography primitives, A lot of what we need to do, like the fact that there is no like native indexing within Ethereum itself, like there just isn't a way to index directly using an Ethereum node, which is kind of crazy, right? Like most of the newer chains just like have this stuff figured out natively, and then as a result of that, you don't have this entire industry built around like data collection, and like the graph and things like that at all, which is quite weird.
Yeah, it's so funny. It's kind of like the sharp edge that you get. Like there's so much opportunity in crypto for new young people who are hungry but are less experienced to hop in and make a big impact. But one sharp edge is we get junior engineering mistakes, which are just a huge problem for the whole industry, 2 years down the line sometimes.
Arjun, I'm curious with if you had to make the same decision on provider today, 10 months later, would you still be going with Orbit?
Difficult question.
Not to put you on the spot.
It's a lot harder. No, it's a lot harder to make that decision now. I think like at the time, we did a lot of research and we spent a lot of time thinking about it. I think at this time it would actually be less of a technical decision and much more of a business decision.
Yeah,
that makes sense.
I mean, I was just going to say you might even make money from choosing to do the open stack today instead of Orbit through like a grant.
Exactly. Yeah, we would. I think the way that the decision would work in this case would be like us going to all of the providers and being like, where can we get the biggest benefit in terms of like help with getting traction, or like grants or subsidized cost basis for like the first year or whatever.
Would you consider block times, like you mentioned, 3 kind of large considerations when you made the initial decision? Would you consider block time still like one of those top 3 considerations?
I think so. I think it is super important. I would say in our original designs, what we were expecting to do, because again, this was like almost a year ago, we didn't know how much of the chain abstraction ecosystem would be built. And so we sort of erred on the side of saying, okay, maybe there are aspects of the rest of the stack that we will need to support, even if they're not things that we're going to charge for or that we're going to like necessarily hold on to long term. And one of the big ones was order flow auctions. Like there was no consensus around the way in which order flow auctions would happen and like where people would integrate into clearing, whether that would need to be tied deeply into the auctions or not. And so at the time we were like, okay, well, we'll just continue to support our existing auction and have it be like an opt-in thing where if people want to auction off intents, they can do it through our system if they need to. But then what happened over the next few months after we kind of made this decision and already had moved forward was things like EIP 7683 were created. There was just better kind of visibility that like a lot of intent protocols would just be running their own auctions, and that it was actually that like intent protocols wanted to own that part of the stack because that was how they owned their users. And so once that kind of happened, we decided to descope. We actually like had a point, I would say like July this year, where we were like, okay, cool, we can basically just delete half of the scope from Everclear because the market has caught up. It's pretty awesome.
Yo, can I get your guys' take on something else? I'm trying to wrap my head around this, and honestly, I don't know why this is happening. Why Uniswap is working so closely with Accrual when it feels like Uniswap X is such a proximate product. So like a couple days ago, for anybody who didn't see, it was like effectively Uniswap rolled bridging into their front end and made it very clear that this was powered by Accrual. And so they've collaborated on this cross-chain intents ERC. But to me, it was very, very surprising that they highlighted Accrual this strongly, almost in my view, like to the detriment of what Uniswap X could have expanded into. I'm trying to wrap my head around this, and I honestly just don't see a massively like clear strategic reason for this. Anybody feel like they see the rationale for this?
I mean, the only question I would have is like, what's the value of Uniswap X with the unit chain? I
think the bigger question is whether Uniswap actually wants to take on the responsibility of being a cross-chain DEX. So if you look at even Accrual right now, there's a lot of Accrual functionality that's just coming straight from their Oracle UMA, right? And if Uniswap wants to be that guy to sort of take on that responsibility, to some degree, they have to sort of also bear the risk of whatever comes with the Oracle they're using for moving state around. And it's very possible Uniswap just doesn't want to be in the crossfires of anything potentially like cross-chain that could be hacked.
At least from what I've seen, it hasn't been a highlight of Uniswap. And so I kind of agree to some degree with what was mentioned in terms of like sort of delegation of responsibility towards a cross. But, I think at the same time, not to knock Accrual or Uniswap or Unichain or anything like that. But I'm also saying, and I wanted to ask about this, so I'm glad that you brought up Uniswap, Austin, because I don't know if it's necessarily a big problem. Maybe it's beneficial in the short term, but I've seen this issue or this like naming of the functionality that has been integrated with the Uniswap, via Accrual and kind of like the native built-in bridging that they have. And I did a tweet about this the other day, but this has been branded even by Hayden himself to some degree as chain abstraction. So Uniswap is building for chain abstraction because like their DEX has the ability to choose ETH from Ethereum and bridge that to ETH from Optimism or something. I don't know. Right. So like, I feel like the naming or like the term chain abstraction has been thrown around a lot, especially with like Accrual themselves have been using chain abstraction to describe their own protocol. Like their intent-based bridging protocol. They've used chain abstraction as the descriptor of that. Uniswap is, as I mentioned, calling their functionality to some degree chain abstraction, or at least a step towards chain abstraction. And so, I mean, I guess it's subjective whether or not this is a problem, if this is actually beneficial to the chain abstraction's legitimacy in the short term. But I have had some experiences with individuals and organizations that see chain abstraction as way too broad of an idea, where they see it as like, oh yeah, like I'm using this bridge, like that's chain abstraction. And it's like, well, I don't know. At least personally, I see chain abstraction a little bit more narrowly than just like, being able to bridge natively within Uniswap without going to the Accrual website or whatever. It's like, I don't know. What do you guys think about the scope of the term chain abstraction? Would you consider like, the Uniswap's cross-chain implementation to be related to chain abstraction, or at least a step towards chain abstraction?
Dude, I think chain abstraction's made up, but it's a mega boola meme. And if Uniswap is hopping in and it's the train that we've been pushing for months, then hell yeah, I only see that as bullish for us. That's that's my candid take. Like, obviously, like none of this shit is chain abstraction today. It's still so garbage to use. No offense to Basco, but like you guys have done some of the best work on this, like abstracting away, and it's still in the weeds. I don't think we're going to like actually abstract stuff until like fully abstract stuff for a couple years here. So in my view, if Hayden wants to tweet about chain abstraction, I fully back it. Happy to have him on board. That's kind of my stance.
You have a world where like there's an instance of Uniswap on every single chain, and like for some that's chain abstraction, but like for me it's like Uniswap across all chains. No pun intended with like the Accrual coincidence there, but like I don't know. I guess my viewpoint is like it's definitely a step in the right direction, but as Austin mentioned, like I still think we're pretty far away, and just having like an instance of your DApp on every single chain is kind of like where we're already at now, in my opinion.
Yeah, I definitely think it's less cool of a flex than like a universal account. That is for sure.
I've always been. We did this article a while back, like formally defining chain abstraction, and like the reason we did that was because. Like, and I kind of agree with what you said, Austin, in terms of like, it's good that Hayden is bringing attention to chain abstraction, but I forget who said it. There was somebody the other day that was like, well, if it's too broad, then maybe people don't understand the true value of like what chain abstraction will bring, like, even though that's like not been really fully realized yet in terms of like an actual functioning product. But I think that, yeah, sometimes I'm hesitant to like tag along with calling things like what Uniswap is integrated under the chain abstraction umbrella. I know it's just semantics, but the tweet that I did, I think I specifically said, I said having an in-app, manual in-app bridging is not, manual in-app bridging, like specifically emphasis on manual, is not chain abstraction. I would consider that to just be cross-chain, like what Uniswap has implemented via Accrual. I don't see that as a line of chain abstraction. But I mean, yeah, if we want to call it that, then it's fine. Maybe it's helpful, or maybe it actually broadens things too much and confuses the term. Burnt, what do you think about this? I think Arjun's hand was up before.
You go, Arjun, too.
It will become chain abstraction as soon as Unichain is solved, right? As soon as you're swapping on the Unichain instead of on your local Uniswap instance, it's now chain abstracted.
If you look up chain abstraction, it's like near Everclear, particle Zion, and it's all the title is always what is chain abstraction, and it's like I find that funny. I actually kind of enjoy it, and I think there's like a hidden beauty in it of it just being very vague. I know that it might quote unquote take away, but I think that you're getting a lot more people joining in, either thinking they're building chain abstraction or not. But either way, you're getting more builders into the space and more money into the space, and more attention to the space. And I think for everyone, all of that is good. And I've always been on a proponent that it's been pretty solid. To Austin's point, that it's almost intentionally a little vague and broad because it allows a lot of people to come in and expand the narrative. And I think at the end of the day, like all of us kind of go on to the same point of, crypto sucks, and whether the scope is broad or the scope is narrow, I think that as long as we're all building for something that actually is solving for anything, I don't really see too much of a problem in that.
I usually love to fight with Burnt, but I'm actually with him on this one. It's just kind of like, all right, flexible enough meme. Anybody who actually wants to make using crypto easier, hop on board. That's kind of my stance.
The only thing I worry about is the overuse. I guess that's the better way to articulate it, is the overuse of chain abstraction. To be honest, I think modularity had a very clear value proposition and scope, especially as it started to gain traction with Celestia. And Celestia did a lot of work in trying to define it very narrowly. But I think what happened was that the modular term started getting overused. And everybody started using modular, and then I think it lost a lot of meaning. Maybe it's like gotten a little bit back to where it was, because I think that narrative maybe isn't as popular as it was, like 8 months ago. But I think that to some degree, I think reduced a lot of the value of what modular blockchain architecture actually has, to like, okay, it's just like, this doesn't actually really mean anything. And whenever somebody says that they're modular, it doesn't actually reflect anything about their project. So my worry is that with chain abstraction, that'll be similar. It's like, okay, they're chain abstracted. Are they just saying that they're chain abstraction, or is this like actually the vision of chain abstraction?
Well,
yeah.
All right. I'm going to give a counter stance here that it's actually bullish. So if you think about, like I totally agree that there's a point where a flexible and powerful enough meme gets kind of like spun out of control, and people are just literally today I saw a website that said modular AVS L2 focused on chain abstraction. And so like
I also looked at the Omni website today.
Oh my God, that's good. But okay, well, fuck you, Burnt. but like if you think about it, it's kind of like all these like random projects that just say like buzzword salad. Like when you think of modular, you still think of Celestia. You don't think of all these tail projects that are just like grabbing this buzzword to try and like shill to some VCs. So I don't know. I feel like it can be beneficial to the projects in this world. Let's say it's chain abstraction. People who are actually driving it forward, where they're not making users bridge, where the bridging just happens implicitly behind the scenes. I do feel like there's an opportunity to kind of be like canonical winner projects in a meme, and it'd actually be beneficial for all these tail projects to kind of like try to grab onto the meme and ride the wave, but even if they're not really contributing a ton in terms of innovation.
I kind of do agree with Tabasco. I think the giant fear with chain abstraction not being clearly articulated and defined is we end up with trust minimization 2.0. And for those who don't remember, somewhere around 2022, 2023, at least the beginning of it, almost every messaging protocol said they were trust minimized, to the point where no one really even knew what trust minimized meant anymore, right? And after a while, what ended up happening was the term just got ignored. I do think it's possible for chain abstraction as a narrative to be successful, but as a tool for at least explaining to people what we're trying to do and the functionality we're trying to enable, for it to become worthless by it not being very specific in what it sort of like means to the end user.
You wrote the article. What was it? Why everyone is wrong about chain abstraction or something like that. Did you talk about this idea there, or was that more clinical?
So I did to some degree, but I guess it was really early on. So like the idea then was more so centered around chain abstraction is definitely not just bridging, and it's definitely not just the ability to execute transactions across chains. It's more so this idea of being able to take all your accounts across every chain or multiple different chains and using them to execute any transaction you want to execute on any chain. So it's more so of a sort of like unification of a bunch of separate accounts across different chains, as opposed to you just being able to zap assets from one chain to another to execute a transaction, or you being able to build a cross-chain app that can sort of interact with assets or state from different chains. And part of it was because, again, back then, the idea was very much centered around chain abstraction, particularly from the lens of users and wallets and not necessarily from apps. But I do think a good chunk of it still sort of like remains the core sort of like image most people in the space have about chain abstraction, this world where you can just pick up your wallet and go anywhere and do anything you want without sort of like having to care about what's happening on the underlying sort of like chains and the interactions between them. And I do think like if that gets blurred to the point where folks don't really know what chain abstraction is, like just chain abstraction as a vehicle for onboarding people through, let's say, onboarding apps or onboarding developers becomes really hard. But as a narrative, yeah, the narrative can be great. People can sort of like know about it. Everyone knew about modularity as a narrative. No one really understood. Very few people understood what modularity meant as a sort of like tool to the end user. And chain abstraction can end up in the same sort of like vertical.
One thing that I'm seeing happen is, sure, in this chain abstraction meme, cool, fantastic opportunities to improve the UX today. That is totally, that is an opportunity that we all see. However, I'm not really seeing anybody like fully lean into chain abstraction from the perspective of like actually onboarding noise. I feel like that's obviously the like end boss that we're all talking about here, or at least like this meme. That's what it's like. Oh, make it so that normal people can use this stuff. Like that's what we're all building for. But I honestly don't see any, and this is Omni included. I'll just like call us out. I don't see any projects really focusing on onboarding like this end boss type like customer segment. Maybe I'm just not seeing projects though. Anybody have any like visibility into projects actually working on this right now?
You mean like from the infrastructural standpoint, or you mean like applications? Like you think like infrastructure should have the like consumer onboarding in scope?
I mean, just like literally the canonical, like, can my mom use it type thing. I feel like, okay, universal accounts, for example, I feel like for me, it's going to help me like manage all the like shitcoins that I have across all these different platforms.
Right.
But it's still like, it's still a ways away from my mom being able to use it. And again, not to like say anything about Particle. You guys are doing great work, but I don't know. It feels like we're still very insular focused, even the teams that are talking about chain abstraction the most. And maybe that's just like the stage of maturation that we're at. But yeah.
Austin, I think I've seen you every day for like every Friday for the past like at least a year and a half, and I have not shut the fuck up about exactly that. I don't know if this is a T-ball or you're blind, but either way, Tabasco, you can take that.
I think yeah, I'm sure Burnt has a good response. Maybe then what I was gonna say is invalidated because I think Zion is doing some good stuff around this. But what I was gonna say is like I think in general, at the point in the ecosystem that we're at, I think it's sort of a sequence where we need to first solve the problem that we have like within the internal Web3 community, and like because that is a much easier problem to solve, like the user experience for people that are already familiar with Web3. If that can be solved to the degree where it's like you said, like it's almost instantaneous to use, you don't need to like worry about the changes using whatever, like the usual pitch, then I think that's a foundation for them thinking about like onboarding normal people, like in air quotes. I think that there's like I think thinking about that right now is too early for the infrastructure capabilities that we have. And so I think that like most chain abstraction work is like still getting the foundations ready and actually solving the fundamental problem there. I don't think solving the fundamental problem of like chain fragmentation is going to result in consumer onboarding, if I'm being honest. I think it will be like one huge step that will lead us to a point where we can have infrastructure, we can have experiences that are focused and centered around like consumers. And some people will tell you like, oh, there's this project like in Solana that's already like doing consumer onboarding, or like there's this project on Base or whatever, which I'm sure that they are. But like from a larger scale experience standpoint in Web3, I think there's still more dominoes that need to fall until we're at that point where like that can be a core focus in terms of like the end experience. I think that like, for example, with universal accounts or with, other things, it's still just like, how can you like unify balances and do so in a way that is like low risk and quick? And so like, that's a very basic problem to solve. And how can you like automatically bridge using solvers and do this in a way that's decentralized and have like properly incentivized, a solver economy, all these different things, right? If you can solve that, then you can kind of move down the ladder of problems here until you can maybe have an experience that is, or have a focus that can be more around consumer onboarding. So I just think that's kind of how I see it. I think it's maybe a little bit too early with where we're at.
Yeah.
I think it depends on like what the scope is. And I think it's interesting because I think we look at like, you look at scope as like depth versus width. I think this is like, genuinely, this is probably one of the reasons why we only focused on consumer applications, at least for like the short while, right? Which is, and I think it's also a part of the conversation, like why we're not really, really, really immensely involved in like the solver conversation, etc., is because, for us, there are things such as like multi-chain, let's call it balances right now, that it's not inherently important, but like multi-chain functionality is really, really important, right? And I think that for us, like focusing on consumer applications as they relate to any chain, it's kind of a depth in the depth in the specialty, not necessarily like this width in everything. And I think I think Tabasco actually, and I think the Particle team, and I think especially Everclear's right here, everyone's here, but I think the one wallet on every chain is extremely incredible on that width, right? But I think for us, it's like we have a few niche use cases that we're really, really focused on, and it's like, I think as a company or as a whatever, as a project, Zion is really sprinting towards, I want, everything. I don't want a user to end up seeing crypto. And then I think that there becomes like this backfill of, okay, great. How do we then expand that to other use cases outside of something like consumer application?
All right, Arjun, so polite. Let's go. What you got?
Dude, he's had his hand up the whole time. It's giving me anxiety at this point.
Same, man.
I think that's just an X thing. But I only really put my hand up like 15 seconds ago. So, yeah, I mean, I think like, so I have a bit of a I guess the question to ask here is like, what does user onboarding mean, right? Like, and I think my controversial take here is that it's potentially going to look kind of similar to the discussion we had around like RAS and rollup frameworks, where like ultimately chain abstraction infrastructure providers are going to have to make a choice, which is going to be like, do we want to own the user directly? Or do we want to like partner with a bunch of distribution channels and hope that they don't rug us? And like, there's one of two options you can kind of go for here. It's like either you eventually sort of work towards becoming a wallet in some form, because you are just providing the like interface for the user to be able to go and interact with the Web3 world, or you are like selling to a bunch of applications and then in a part of the distribution stack through them where you don't necessarily control the user, but you still have like some amount of defensibility. At least from my perspective, it feels like over time you're going to just have like a just straight head-to-head competition between like wallets and like chain abstraction providers, just because like for the wallets, if they already have a bunch of users, creating an order flow auction or creating some mechanism to unify balances once these things already exist is like somewhat easier. And so yeah, I'm kind of curious to hear takes from especially people that are doing wallet level chain abstraction here, because that must be something that's interesting to think about as you guys go and talk to wallets.
Yeah, I think this is interesting. I think like Rich might actually have maybe a more like compatible take with wallet providers. I think from our perspective, because we do a lot of the AA side, we have very similar like a very similar scope to how you look at just like smart accounts in general. This will change with like more AA proposals and stuff like that as they kind of merge more with EOAs. But I think with our angle, we always look at it like some wallets are going to implement chain abstraction. A lot of them aren't going to want to do this themselves. Especially, I mean, it depends where the value accrual is. I don't think that there's like a huge amount of value accrual in developing that yourself, at least not enough to warrant the engineering hours. So I think things like MetaMask, and to be honest, like we've had conversations with MetaMask and some of these guys, and like I think they don't necessarily want to like do all of this themselves. So I think the positioning for a lot of these account level solutions is that some of these wallets are going to especially the larger wallets, are going to implement some account level solution. Whether that will happen, will maintain that long term, and they'll move over to their own solutions. Who knows? But I think, some applications will implement it directly, especially with things like smart accounts. A lot of wallets are going to implement this directly, and apply the property of balance unification to their existing users, as well as a lot of new wallets. Like I would even say that I think MetaMask and a lot of these bigger wallets are going to take a lot of time to actually move towards a chain abstracted experience or a unified balance, because they're just historically slow movers, especially MetaMask. So I think what I would even expect you'll see is some newer wallets that tend to grab more mind share because they are chain abstracted. And so I think a lot of those probably won't be built by the chain abstraction protocols themselves necessarily, but more so just teams that are already building wallets, maybe existing wallets that jump the gun on chain abstraction before the bigger ones do. And therefore, because it's kind of like Rabby, right? I mean, Rabby has a good user experience, and that alone was enough to bring a lot of people over from MetaMask to Rabby. Not a massive proportion, but enough to where it proved the model of that wallet. I think unified balances is a big enough leap in user experience to where there will be a good amount of user base and mindshare that goes towards wallets that adopt that first. I think MetaMask will eventually do it. Same thing with Phantom and all these guys, and it's an inevitability if they want to stay competitive in the market. But I think that they'll most likely probably use existing chain abstraction solutions to do so, because building it out in-house doesn't always make sense. At least this is the feedback that we've gotten from our conversations with these wallets. And I know that Orb Labs, with you guys doing an actual provider, I'm curious what you think about this. I'm sure you have an interesting take.
So this is a question we're sort of forced to grapple with really early on, given that we chose not to build a wallet. We more so built an RPC sort of system that made it possible for you to offer the same kind of chain abstraction solution by just making a few changes to your code base. And the thought process for why we chose this route was obviously, one, we didn't want to sort of compete with wallets, but also we're pretty sure that in the long term, it wouldn't make sense for most wallets to build this in-house. For the same reason why they don't build their own node providers. And in most cases, they integrate with things like bridge aggregators, because there's this consistent sort of amount of work needed to maintain these systems that expand to new chains, find the best sort of routes to make things happen for the end user, and facilitate all these sort of multi-chain interactions. And for most wallets, even the biggest ones, the question is, do you want to sort of dedicate consistent amount of time and effort to make all the systems run? That being said, there's always the idea of products verticalizing over time. So there's a world where if you're a wallet solution using a third-party provider, and at some point you realize that, hey, you have more than enough resources to sort of bring in-house a whole team that does that amount of work, then sure, there's a world where some of these wallets will take on that responsibility. But the question is how many of them? The wallet market, even though it's dominated by a few sort of pretty big players, is also pretty large. There are a number of smaller wallets out there, and it's highly unlikely that all the wallet players will want to build this infrastructure in-house. And even those who are sort of big that may want to build that infrastructure in-house, it probably won't be instant. It'll be something where they sort of look at the market for a bit, look at which players exist and what functionality enable and how it fits with the existing system, and decide to integrate. And maybe over time, maybe after several years, after you sort of gone through all the things in your backlog and you have more time on your hands, and your developers are twiddling their fingers looking for things to do, you can circle back and sort of build out this infrastructure yourself. But I think it's going to take some time.
Yeah, I agree. I think I have basically the same take. I think a lot of the value accrual, especially for these providers, will come from implementation directly within these wallets, at least for the account level providers, or the more wallet directed providers like Orb Labs, Particle, and others. I think that's where a lot of the value will accrue from. I think Arjun just got kicked off, so I'm going to approve him again. Naruto, I know that you've had your hand up for a little while. You have any takes on this general topic?
A lot of things that I've seen is people are still confused on what chain abstraction is. They think that they can build some kind of things on top of it, like some kind of dApp, which is, I'm not sure how much is going to be the value proposition over there. But what I think is one thing that I see, and it's you can think of as a controversial take, is that there's so many, or few of you guys, the chain abstraction, people who are solving, these level of things. We at Avail are also doing something similar with Nexus. The problem lies on when or what is used more Like at this point we are competing, so like the chain abstraction idea itself is getting fragmented, or like the user base is fragmented, which is like a very funny thing to me, because then users are like, oh, what do I use? Or the wallets are like, which one do we use? That kind of stuff. So at this point it's like more of like a competitive race. I don't know, it's like just a thought that I had in mind. Like there's so many projects that are working on it, so there's a little bit like fragmentation even in the chain abstraction field.
This is, I had like a short list of like random topics that I wanted to maybe roughly touch on within the space, and this is actually one of them, was like fragmentation between chain abstraction providers. I'm curious what some of you guys think about this. I think this is an interesting, just like quick thing to touch on. I don't really see it as a big problem, to be completely honest. I think the only place where you're going to see fragmentation is maybe between account level providers, because of the existing fragmentation between smart accounts for those that use smart accounts. But I think that that's a very temporary problem that's like going to be solved very quickly, like maybe even like Q1. I think that there's a lot of solutions for this, and especially with the newer account abstraction proposals, this is not really a long-term issue, I think. And even like between the application level chain abstraction providers, like those that are actually doing developer facing SDKs, that's just application specific. So I don't really see fragmentation there either. I think for most of the chain abstraction stack, they're all pretty complementary, or at least they target the same scope, to the point where like whether I'm using solution A versus solution B, it's basically the same for the end user, and they ideally shouldn't know. It should be down to the wallet or the application or whatever it is that they're using, and they just maintain like the same account state and balance across all these experiences. And whether they're using some provider versus the others, I think should be relatively relevant. I think there are some like challenges with that right now, only around smart accounts. I think that's the main place where you find fragmentation, but I don't see that as a long-term problem. Does anybody else have a take on this fragmentation between chain abstraction providers?
I think it's good. Let them compete. I think it's okay. I think it's good if we align around minimal interfaces, like ERC 7683. I think that's the like cross-chain intense one. It's like, cool. All right, let's align around one data structure. Everybody can probably get behind that. But past that, let them compete. Otherwise, we're just going to get stuck with garbage and everything's going to get slowed down. So that's kind of my stance. Sorry if that's aggro, but that's just how I think.
No, that's I agree with
that.
None
of us are aggro here. Don't worry.
I argue it's not possible to have fragmentation for single player utility systems. And for most chain abstraction solutions, even the wallet and the app ones, for the most part, they're all single player utility systems. If a single app or single wallet makes this change, it doesn't impact people who use different wallets and people who use different systems. And so fragmentation is sort of like it's non-existent if the system is a single player system. I don't even think the problem exists, to sort of like back up what Tabasco's saying.
Yeah, this kind of ties into the conversation that some people say, like, does chain abstraction need to be defined by a standard? Like, I think you can have like cross-chain intent standards, which is like a lower level thing than chain abstraction itself, but I don't see chain abstraction as actually being in scope of a standard or needing any standardization really, except for the lower level things like cross-chain intents or smart accounts or whatever. But these are not like directly chain abstraction. These are like components of chain abstraction, because we talked about like chain abstraction is an experience, and so like I think because of that, it can be universalized in a way that doesn't need much standardization, as long as the user feels the same across all these experiences.
Yep.
Like chain abstraction is basically competing for or conflicting with the value accrual of a lot of generalized blockchains, layer 1 blockchains, even generalized layer 2s. Blockchains right now, they're like not super anti-chain abstraction, at least from what we've seen, but they will grow to be anti-chain abstraction as soon as they see that users are being taken away from their brand and their chain. Because what I think is going to happen is that if users are agnostified, and they don't know what chain that they're using, then chains only can accrue value through onboarding developers. And so I would even go as far to say like most chains that are technologically inferior, objectively technologically inferior, and only survive today because of some existing siloed applications or users, or because of some narrative attached to it, I think most of those will actually die out, because there's no, like, why would a developer build on a chain that is objectively inferior to some other alternative, or even to an app chain, if like there's no reason to? Because like there's no acquisition of users. There's no business benefits from building on a lot of these generalized chains anymore. And so I think over time, public chains are going to realize that there's a conflict between the chain abstraction experience and their value accrual, especially if they're like these very large generalized chains that don't have a very specific technological advantage that like a moat for themselves. Do you guys see this as being a possible future where like, you know, these layer ones, these layer twos maybe actively fight against chain abstraction? Like we've actually produced a few articles with like Say and Tycho and Barachain, and these guys right now at least are all very like, yeah, chain abstraction is great. I think like if there's a very specific value proposition for a given chain, like Barachain for example, I don't think chain abstraction will actually reduce value. It might even improve value, because as a developer I can deploy there without like, you know, any downsides attached to like lack of users or like the friction attached to getting people to bridge in or whatever. But do you guys think that generalized chains are going to lose value and there's going to be a shift in the public blockchain market as a result of chain abstraction? Like, is this going to be a chain abstraction versus public chain battle?
Maybe from like a narrative perspective, but I think like the fact that most of these public chains are themselves, and this is before chain abstraction even existed, themselves were going down the process of like, you know, replicating themselves and then pushing towards creating more app chains and have like bet billions of dollars on doing this. Like, I think given that that's already something that people have bought into mentally, it feels to me like I don't expect any animosity coming from, I mean, and then this is just based off the conversations we've had so far. Like, I don't expect any animosity coming from any of the like major chain providers. It's like baked into their mental model. And in fact, I think it's actually kind of the opposite, where like as any kind of project or any kind of startup, like ultimately you have to go to where the market is going. And sometimes that just means killing your babies, right? And so like we know that this like single general purpose chain model is what exists right now and is everybody's baby. But like I think most, like, you know, Arbitrum, Optimism, ZK Sync, et cetera, everyone has been working towards killing their babies for a while. And like, I think that's already kind of baked into their assumptions, and they have more resourcing going towards doing that than not at the moment.
I would tend to agree with that. I mean, like the way that I view it, right, is you already have what, 2, 3, 5,000 chains, or like, you know, L1s at the moment. And it's like, they've already been in competitive positioning for years. And so when we go from, let's say, 2,000 to 20,000 to 200,000, it's like, will the competition continue to increase? Probably. But like the top ones, I think will continue to cement their position. And like you said, there may be, it may not always be like the main criteria is like the tech underneath. It could just be like culture. So I still think that there'll be like a place for like Azora, for example, where like it's mainly around like minting, creating, sharing memes, etc., versus like incredibly fast block times or like inclusion, etc. But I guess the only thing that I would disagree with Arjun on is like the internal kind of like monologue that they're having. I think if I was a L1 operator, I'd be somewhat fearful in the sense that, like Tabasco said, you know, in a future where users will simply just interact with whatever dApp they want, you know, we'll truly have to compete on like pure product market fit and away from like siloed experience, siloed liquidity, etc. So if you're like a chain that's known for being X, like in a future where there's 10 plus X's, I think that's just like a net benefit for users. But I think like that will come at the harm of some of those like maybe tier 2 chains that haven't like fully crossed the chasm into like tier 1. But anyways, that'd be the only thing that I would probably disagree with, is like naturally they have to be aware that there's like increased competition coming. And I think naturally some of these operators will realize that like what they've built doesn't really have a lot of defensibility. And whether they're like outwardly public about it, I think they should at least be aware that in this future world, they may become less and less utilized.
Yeah, I agree with you there. I was specifically referring to kind of like bigger chains that have their own frameworks, or like rollup frameworks or things like that. But yeah, a lot of the like longer tail one-off L1s, any L1 that has not actually figured out how to like build their own community in a unique way, and like that isn't servicing a unique set of users that really, really cares about them, is probably going to die. And like that's
as they should.
Probably exactly. Like there's a lot of really, really stupid trash out there, unfortunately. And because like it's just impossible for tokens to die, and people will just continue they will just continue existing forever.
Do you guys think that there's like that big of a place for generalized L1s in like the chain abstraction environment? Or is it just like because some people have expressed like generalized blockchains, L1s, L2s, whatever, are like a stepping stone to eventually scaling into an app chain. So they're not like especially for successful applications, they're not like a long form, like place to deploy the app. It'll all like a lot of the big part of like the app chain thesis is that it'll all eventually graduate to an app chain once their needs exceed the limitations of a given generalized blockchain. Do you guys think that this is going to be like the case, or like most generalized L1s that don't adapt to this future and don't, like, as Arjun said, create kind of their own ecosystems of whatever you have, like what do they call it? zk Elastic Chain, Optimism Orbit, all these things, or sorry, Arbitrum Orbit. For chains that don't adapt to that, do you guys think that most of those will potentially die out, or do you think that they still have a role?
I mean, I don't think there's really been enough reason for like a lot of apps to spin off of their main chain, right? Like maybe the example is UIDX, but I mean, aside from probably regulatory reasons, like and maybe value reasons, or just it being a bear market, like there really hasn't been much in my mind, many successful products that have said, you know, we're really hitting the limits of X, Y, and Z. And like I think a lot of conversations can happen in like the purely hypothetical, which is totally fine. I think that there will be eventually projects that do that. But I think we haven't really seen a hyper successful product yet, to a point where I'll say, yeah, I think at least for some time, generalized L1s will work. I think that you're gonna start seeing special, you know, just in any market you start to see specialization, right? So you can't really stay general forever. People in some capacities are going to make decisions that cater DeFi or gaming or some aspects there more than others. And I think it's just a natural progression of the markets.
What about stuff like Aave and Uniswap?
I mean, I think there's like, I mean, I guess you're seeing that now, right? I guess, but like, were those decisions because they were really, really like hitting the upper limits, or was that for other reasons, such as like?
I think it's probably economic, right? Like,
yeah, that's what I mean. Like,
what is the
exactly
marginal cost of like fragmenting liquidity and bootstrapping liquidity on another chain versus being like, okay, you know what, we'll pay the additional onboarding costs for users to have them all to concentrate all the liquidity.
Well, I mean, yeah, exactly, and I think from a value perspective, it's definitely more worth it for them to be, especially, you know, you look at the top 100 on CoinMarketCap, you know, they were losing their place because they weren't an L1, and now they're up there with the other L1s, right? You know, and I think that's the unfortunate aspect of this industry, where you tend to resort to being infrastructure, because I don't think that the ability for an application is quite there yet.
Beyond just narrative though, and like terminology attached to like token valuation and stuff like that, do you or anyone else think that the value proposition of launching an L1 and controlling the that entire stack as an application is enough to see an exodus towards app chains, even if they don't outgrow necessarily like the base layer that they deploy on? But do you think that the value proposition there is beyond just narrative is large enough?
Personally, yeah. Like, there's like a really simple. I mean, look, like as any business, you're just and you should treat these things as businesses, even if they're not, right? Like as any organization that is focused around sustainability, the big thing that you care about is like your customer acquisition cost and like your bottom line sustainability. And I think the cost of like bootstrapping liquidity in an ever growing number of ecosystems just grows infinitely. And like, I think for any kind of DeFi application over time, especially as it gets large enough to have to go and expand to a bunch of different ecosystems, they're going to hit this point where they're like, well, the cost of going and expanding is way higher than the cost of just bringing users to me through chain abstraction and by having my own chain. And like when you tack that onto the sovereignty benefits and like the value capture benefits around like, you know, capturing sequencer revenue and things like that, like it feels like really compelling. And it also kind of makes sense, right? It's like, I mean, for any larger application, the other major reason is just the like, you know, having like sharing resources with other people. So like if you are a really, really major application, like say Reddit finally builds community points, like they're not going to build it on Arbitrum 1. Why? Because like any random like Degen can go and create some sort of Ponzi scheme on Arbitrum 1 that just takes down the entire chain. And then Reddit's infrastructure gets affected. And like no, even we like as a relatively smaller app chain have this concern where we're like, well, we don't want to like end up in a situation where because someone's RPC infrastructure or chain went down because of something completely unrelated, Everclear stops working. And having that sovereignty, having our own like completely separated infrastructure, completely separated RPCs, just gives us a guarantee that that's not going to happen at all.
Yeah, no, I think that makes a lot of sense. And we talked about this a little bit. I think Zon was in here earlier in the audience, but we talked about this on the roundtable this morning, which was like, I think the long-term vision is like most applications, most serious, larger applications will, I think, launch their own app chains. The cost of launching an app chain is lowering, and the overhead of getting people onto your app chain is effectively removed with chain abstraction. And so like it comes to the question of like, why not? Like why, at that point, why launch on a generalized blockchain if you can accrue way more value by and have a lot more resilience by launching an app chain? And so, and it's very easy, and it doesn't, it's relatively inexpensive today, depending upon what you're launching. And so I think that like this is just a question of like, how do you accrue value as an application in Web3? I think it inevitably has to go to app chains. And so I think there's going to be an interesting kind of change in market dynamic between public blockchains. I'm not anti like, generalized chains at all. I think a lot of them are fantastic, but I think that just because of the way that the market is moving, and to be honest, in a large part because of the implementation of chain abstraction, we're going to see more developers launching app chains, way more in the near future, maybe even eventually more than that are building on generalized blockchains, just because of that value proposition. Yeah, go ahead, Dan.
No, I think that's a good take. I mean, while you're like, we're saying that, it kind of like came up in mind of like the mall to e-commerce moment, where it's like in the 90s, right? You had like all these shops that came and like agreed to be part of like a mall and like pay into the fees, pay into X, Y, and Z, in order to kind of get that foot traffic and like viewership. And then like with the rise of e-commerce, that kind of like spread out where like that individual brick and mortar shop wasn't like as needed. Might be a dumb analogy, but it's kind of like the way I'm thinking like through that question now, where it's like in the future where like it becomes as easy as like a Shopify where I click a few buttons, I have my own website, I control shipping, I control like branding, X, Y, and Z. Like what is the reason to go to like a core L1? And then I think that's kind of goes back to like the last point of like, I think we'll still have those specialized, like we'll still have extremely specialized L1s that like deserve or like can attract that demand. But in like in so many other ways, like it makes so much sense to have your own setup. The only thing that I'm somewhat fearful of right now is like, I think in a world of abstraction, we sometimes become like very reliant on like core pillars, and like core Lego blocks in that mapping. And it's like, we're still kind of in that young phase, in my opinion, where we haven't really had like extremely high vulnerabilities across some of like the core infrastructure yet. I hope it stays yet, and like we never do, but that's something that I'm a little bit fearful of as far as like the app chain thesis is like, if any of these building blocks like have critical vulnerabilities that get exposed in the near future, then it's like, okay, it's like it may be more risk to kind of spin up your own than just go to like a optimized L1.
How are you guys at Zion thinking about this kind of trend of app chains? Are you guys positioned for this? What's your actual like product positioning against this?
I mean, I think that we're going to an app chain world at the end of the day. Whether it's in the next year, the next 5 or 10 years, I think it's almost going to be impossible to avoid. And I think we're positioning for it that way. I think it's like, if you would ask me like a personal belief, I do believe that like generalized environments will be very good, and they'll act as test nets in a way, which is like you want to get a proof of concept out quickly. You can deploy on a general, get some traction, and then move over to an app chain, if that's what it is. But I think that like after Solana came out effectively, I think we realized that Ethereum wouldn't be this winner take all. And I think once that was proven, then it's inevitable that many, many, many more will be coming out.
Thank you, Rich, Bernd, Dan, and Arjun for hopping in today. I think go follow Everclear, go follow Zion, go follow Gashawk, go follow Orb Labs, as well as many others that joined in. We had Naruto from Avail. We had Austin from Omni, and a few others. So I appreciate you guys taking and spending, was it like an hour and a half today talking about chain abstraction. I think